Okay, I want you to try something for me right now. It's a little weird, but just stay with me. Pause for a second and just
Right.
listen. No, not to me, not to the traffic outside. Listen to the voice inside your own head. You know the one. The one that's narrating everything, maybe judging my intro, maybe panicking about an email you forgot to send. It feels like the absolute core of who you are, right? That internal monologue. It is you. But what if it wasn't? What if, just a few thousand years ago, that voice in your head was considered a god?
It's a thought that is. I mean, it's simultaneously terrifying and completely exhilarating. It makes you question the one thing you take for granted more than anything else, your own consciousness. And that brings us to one of the most controversial, difficult, and frankly mind-bending books of the 20th century. We're talking about Julian Jaynes and his absolute doorstopper of a title, The Origin of Consciousness in the Breakdown of the Bicameral Mind.
Yeah, even the title is a workout. But the idea inside, it's even heavier. Because we're so used to thinking that humans have been conscious, self-aware, making decisions, pretty much since we figured out how to use fire. Basically, once our brains were baked, we were us. But Jane says, absolutely not.
That's a standard assumption, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Biology is the hardware, and we just assume the software's been running for, hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah.
James just throws a grenade into that whole timeline. He argues that human consciousness, the way we experience it right now, is a learned cultural invention. It's a software update, not a hardware upgrade. And the part that really upsets people, he dates this invention to only about 3,000 years ago.
Okay, stop right there. 3,000 years? That's nothing. That's yesterday.
Yeah.
We're talking about the people who built the pyramids, the societies that wrote the Code of Hammurabi, the heroes of the Trojan War. And you're telling me Jaynes thinks the person who designed the Great Pyramid wasn't conscious? How do you even do math without a conscious mind?
It sounds impossible, doesn't it?
Yeah.
I mean, it goes against every single intuition we have. But Jaynes argues they were operating under a completely different mental system. He called it the bicameral mind.
Mm-hmm.
Two chambers. One part of the brain spoke commands, hallucinated commands, and the other part just obeyed. No introspection, no, I wonder if I should use limestone or granite. Just a voice and then action.
I have to push back on this, and I feel like our listeners probably doing the exact same thing. If they weren't conscious, how did they function? I mean, I can't even buy coffee without a massive internal debate about oat milk. If they didn't have that, were they just zombies?
Not zombies, no,
Yeah.
not at all. They were brilliant, capable humans, but they were reacting rather than introspecting. To understand how that's even possible, we have to look at how Jaynes defines consciousness. He spends the first big chunk of the book just tearing down our definitions because he thinks we confuse consciousness with just thinking or perceiving.
Yeah, he gets philosophical very fast. He uses that metaphor of the flashlight in a dark room, which I actually found really helpful.
It's the best way to grasp his point. I mean, imagine you have a flashlight and you're searching around a totally dark room looking for something that isn't lit up. You can't find it. Everywhere the flashlight beam lands, there's light. So the flashlight concludes, the whole room is bright.
Why?
We are the flashlight. We only notice our minds when we're introspecting, so we assume we're introspecting all the time. But we aren't.
So most of my day, I'm just on autopilot.
Think about it. When you were driving your car today, do you remember every single time you checked your mirror?
Yeah.
Every slight turn of the wheel?
Not really. I was mostly thinking about what to have for lunch.
Right. And you were operating a 2-ton machine at high speeds, making thousands of tiny, complex calculations, and you did it all unconsciously. Jaynes makes this sharp distinction between consciousness and reactivity. In fact, he argues that consciousness often just gets in the way of skilled performance.
That reminds me of, the yips in sports, or a pianist. If a concert pianist is playing some insanely complex piece and they suddenly stop to consciously think, okay, where does my ring finger go next?
The music stops, they crash, the whole performance just collapses. Consciousness is slow, reactivity is fast. Jaynes cites the Marbe experiment, which is a classic. They'd ask people to lift 2 weights and say which was heavier, and people would lift them and instantly go, this one. But when they were asked how they knew, the actual mental process, they had no idea. They couldn't explain it.
The judgment just popped into their head.
The math happened in the dark. The result appeared in the light. So Jaynes asks, if we can learn and judge and act without consciousness, what is consciousness actually for?
And this is where we get to the part that really kind of melted my brain a little bit. If consciousness isn't reacting to the world, Jaynes says it's more like a map we build entirely out of language.
This is the absolute crux of the theory. No language, no consciousness.
Wait, but animals communicate. My definitely lets me know when he's hungry. Does he have a mind in the Jaynesian sense?
Jaynes would say no. Your dog communicates signals, sure, but he doesn't use metaphor. And for Jaynes, consciousness is built brick by brick from metaphor. He breaks it down into the metaphrand, that's the thing you're trying to describe, and the metaphor, the thing you use to describe it.
Okay, let's ground this. An example from the book is the leg of a table. A table doesn't have a biological leg, but we use the familiar idea of a human leg, the metaphor, to describe that wooden stick holding it up.
Exactly, and that creates a new concept, a new way of understanding table.
Mm-hmm.
Now, take that same process and turn it inward. We use physical metaphors to describe mental acts. We say we grasp an idea.
Or we see a solution.
We feel weighed down by a problem. None of those things are physically happening in your brain. You aren't grasping anything with your neurons.
So we've built an imaginary physical world inside our heads.
He calls it a mind space. It's an imaginary room generated by language where we can move ideas around as if they were objects. And the most important character in that room is the analog eye.
The avatar, our little avatar of ourselves.
Precisely. You can close your eyes right now and imagine yourself walking on a beach.
Mm-hmm.
That you on the beach isn't your physical body, it's your analog eye.
Right.
This is what allows us to narratize our lives, to step out of the present moment and look at our own timeline. And speaking of which, notice how we even talk about time.
We treat it like it's space. We look forward to the future. We put the past behind us. We map events onto a timeline that moves left to right.
That is all metaphor. Without language to turn time into a spatial concept, you can't really introspect. You can't deceive yourself. You can't have an internal monologue because there's no internal space to have the conversation in.
So, if I'm following this, before we developed enough metaphorical language to build this mind space, humans didn't have an internal monologue. There was no analog eye making decisions.
Great.
Which brings me back to my first problem with this. If there's no eye making decisions, how did Agamemnon or Achilles decide anything? You can't just stand there.
This is where Jaynes puts on his psychological archaeologist hat.
Yeah.
He looks at the earliest literature we have, specifically Homer's The Iliad. And he asks a really strange question. Why is everyone in this book so weird?
I remember reading the Iliad in school. I just thought they were all really dramatic. A lot of yelling and sulking.
It's more than drama. Jaynes argues that if you look at the original Greek and you strip away the modern translations that tried to fix it, there is zero subjectivity in the entire text. No internal debate. No, I think, no, I wonder.
Yeah, I looked up some of the terms he analyzes. This was fascinating. Words that we now translate as mind or soul, they just meant something completely physical back then.
Right. Take the word themos. Later on, it comes to mean spirit or emotion. But in the Iliad, it just meant the physical agitation in your body, the rush of blood, the adrenaline, or nous, which we translate as mind. It really just meant vision, like what you can see.
So when a hero felt fear, he didn't think, I'm afraid. He just felt his thumos, his blood boiling.
It was a somatic bodily feeling, not a mental one. But here's the kicker. What happens when a hero like Achilles has to make a really tough choice? He's standing there. Agamemnon has just insulted him. He's full of stress. He doesn't know whether to draw his sword or to just sit down.
In a modern story, he'd have a whole monologue. On one hand, he's the king. On the other.
But in the Iliad, that doesn't happen. At all. Instead, the goddess Athena literally appears, grabs him by his yellow hair and tells him to stop. He turns around, sees her, and just obeys.
And Jaynes is saying this wasn't just a literary device. He thinks Achilles actually hallucinated a voice.
He thinks the gods were auditory hallucinations, generated by the right hemisphere of the brain to resolve high-stress conflicts.
And this is the bicameral part, the two rooms.
The mind was split. You had the executive chamber, what they called a god, which gave the commands, and you had the follower chamber, the man who simply obeyed.
It's almost like Waze or Google Maps.
That is a fantastic analogy, yes.
I mean, think about it. When I'm driving somewhere new and it's stressful, I don't decide to turn left. The voice says, turn left in 500 feet, and I just do it. I surrender my decision-making to the voice because it knows better.
And what would happen if the GPS just died in the middle of a complex intersection?
Panic. Total chaos.
That is the breakdown of the bicameral mind.
Right.
But for thousands of years, the GPS worked. And it created these incredibly rigid, stable societies.
Yeah.
You didn't need police or guilt if everyone had a voice in their head, the voice of the king or the god telling them exactly what to do. It was a kind of hive mind.
Okay, I'm starting to see the social angle, but I still get hung up on the biology. It just sounds like science fiction. How can one brain support a god and a man separately?
Well, Do we have one brain? This is where Jaynes brings in the hard science to back all this up. He pivots to the actual structure of the brain itself.
The double brain, the left and right hemispheres.
Exactly. We know the brain is lateralized. For most right-handed people, the left hemisphere is where speech lives. Wernicke's area, Broca's area, it's the dominant speaking side.
The man side.
The man side. But the right hemisphere is largely silent in modern humans. However, it has structures that correspond to the speech areas on the left. Jaynes' theory is that in the bicameral era, the right hemisphere wasn't silent. It was the God side. It organized experience, it synthesized patterns, and when a decision was needed, it sent a signal.
A signal?
Across the bridge.
Across the anterior commissure. It's a tiny bridge of nerve fibers connecting the two temporal lobes.
The right hemisphere would speak its decision across this bridge to the left hemisphere. And because the left hemisphere is what processes language, the person would literally hear it, not as a thought, but as an external sound.
But is there any proof the brain can actually work like that? That the two halves can operate so separately?
The split brain patients are the smoking gun here. These are people who had the connection between their hemispheres cut to stop seizures, and the experiments done on them. They are just mind-blowing.
I read about the one with the pictures. They'd flash an image of, say, a nude woman to the patient's left eye, which goes to the right hemisphere.
The non-speaking hemisphere. And the patient would giggle or blush. The right hemisphere saw the image and reacted emotionally, but then the researcher would ask the patient, "Why are you laughing?"
Mm-hmm.
And the left hemisphere, the speaking side, had no idea what was going on.
So the patient would just make something up. They'd say, "Oh, that machine is funny," or "You guys are just weird."
The man side rationalized the reaction of the God side without having access to the actual information.
Mm.
It's proof that you can have complex understanding and reaction without conscious awareness. And then there's the work of Dr. Wilder Penfield.
The neurosurgeon, right?
Yes. When he electrically stimulated the right temporal lobe of patients who were wide awake during surgery, they didn't just hear static. They heard voices, they heard music, they felt a presence like someone was standing right behind them.
So the hardware for hearing voices is just, it's pre-installed, it's sitting there in our temporal lobes.
It is. Jaynes argues the capacity to hallucinate is a fundamental, primitive function of the brain. We've mostly suppressed it, but the wiring is all still there.
You say mostly suppressed. That implies it. It leaks out sometimes.
It does. I mean, think about the authority of sound. You can close your eyes, you can choose not to speak, but you can't close your ears. Hearing is intrusive. To hear is, in a way, to obey. And when that modern suppression fails, we see the bicameral mind peeking through.
Schizophrenia.
Jaynes argues schizophrenia is essentially a relapse into the bicameral state. Look at the symptoms. Patients hear voices. And those voices aren't usually just, having a casual chat.
No, they're commanding, they're critical. Do this, you're worthless.
Exactly like the gods, or at least the angry ones. Jaynes mentions a famous case of a patient at Coney Island. A voice commanded him to walk into the ocean. And he just did it. He almost drowned. He said the cold command was impossible to resist. It just bypassed his will completely.
That's terrifying. To think that the distance between us and that state is just a shift in brain chemistry?
Yeah.
Or extreme stress?
Stress is the key. Remember Achilles? The gods showed up when he was under stress. In modern psychology, stress is the #1 trigger for psychotic episodes. The bicameral mind was a stress management system. When the world gets too complex, you stop thinking and let the god decide.
So if this was such a great system, automatic obedience, stable societies, no existential dread, why did it break? Why did the GPS stop working?
The world just got too loud. Around 1000 BC, we see the Bronze Age collapse. Massive geological catastrophes, mass migrations, trade routes collapsing. Suddenly you had all these different cultures colliding.
Right, so if I'm a bicameral man and my god says kill the intruder, but the intruder's god is telling him to kill me and we don't even speak the same language, the whole system just fails.
Exactly. The god voice works for a stable, isolated tribe. It doesn't work in cosmopolitan chaos. The voices started contradicting each other. Or worse, they went silent. Plus, you had the spread of writing.
Writing killed the radio star.
In a way, yes. Writing lets you store the god's word externally. If the law is on a stone tablet, you don't need to hallucinate the king's voice to remember it. You can just read it. As the voices failed, humans had to figure out how to make decisions for themselves.
We had to learn to deceive ourselves, to hold two possibilities in our minds at once without just acting on one.
We had to invent that internal space, the mind space, to hold the debate. We had to internalize the god. And that is the birth of the analog eye, the birth of us.
It sounds like Like a trauma response, like consciousness was born out of complete desperation.
It was a painful birth. Jaynes points to later literature, books like Ecclesiastes or the Psalms, where the writers just sound desperate. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? We always interpret that as a crisis of faith. Jaynes says it's a crisis of neurology. They aren't talking about spiritual silence. They're talking about literal silence. The hallucinations stopped. We were left alone in the dark with our own flashlights.
Wow. It really makes you look at all of history differently. We think of consciousness as this inevitable pinnacle of evolution, the gold medal of biology. But Jaynes makes it sound like a desperate patch job we hacked together because our old operating system crashed.
And that leads to the most provocative question of all. If consciousness is a cultural invention based on language and metaphor, are we finished?
What do you mean by that?
Well, biological evolution is slow. It takes millions of years. But cultural evolution is fast. If our mind is just software we wrote 3,000 years ago, are we maybe writing the next version right now?
You mean we might be transitioning into something post-conscious?
Why not? We're already offloading so much of our memory and decision-making to external devices, to our phones, to AI. We're changing the metaphors we use to describe ourselves. We used to be souls, then we were minds. Now we talk about processing and bandwidth. As the metaphors change, the consciousness itself changes.
This is something I'm going to be thinking about for a very long time. It's almost like we're building a new bicameral mind, but this time the God side is the algorithm.
It's definitely a possibility worth mulling over.
So here's my challenge to you, the listener. For the rest of today, just pay attention to that narration in your head. Pay attention to the story you're telling yourself about yourself. Is it really you? Or is it just a very convincing metaphor you've learned to inhabit, to cope with a newly silent world?
And remember, just because the gods have gone silent, it doesn't mean the machinery isn't still there, humming in the background, just waiting for the right level of stress to turn back on.
On that happy note, thanks for diving deep with us. We'll catch you on the next one.